So Lucas, I will sort of start things by asking you about that title. We went back and forth a little bit briefly as to what we might call this session, and we came up with the future of Chinese food, which may seem rather curious to some people, because I think when we generally think about Chinese food, we think about things that are deeply rooted in tradition. And a certain way of doing things. Why, in fact, is that appropriate if we're going to talk about your relationship with Chinese cuisine?
I think it's appropriate because I'm in the business of the future of Chinese food. I make Chinese food now. I've made Chinese food for a little while, and I'm quite interested in making Chinese food moving forward. I think that's the crux of the reason. I mean, we could have named this a million other things, but you're totally right. There is something about understanding Chinese food to be traditional and only traditional. And I think sometimes that's because we think of Chinese food as one thing, and we don't often, if we don't know enough about the diversity within Chinese food or how Chinese food progresses, sometimes we can forget that Chinese food is evolving on a daily basis. One of the things I like to remind myself is that there are a lot of people in China, and they eat 3 times a day, just like us. The food is constantly changing. Importantly, the trends in the food lifestyle is changing. The industry is changing very much, and so is the supply chains. And so for that reason, Chinese food is a constantly evolving thing. And we can take this conversation in any direction, whether that means speaking about Chinese food in China or Chinese food here in the United States, which is probably what I've been involved in the most the last couple of years.
Hey, Steph, can we get like some quick background? I've been fascinated by the topic. It's Steph, and sorry to jump in, but I like the line. Well, what's the Yale story, your story, quick? Just a couple minutes would be great, and then we get into the food.
I'd be more than happy to tell everybody. So my name is Lucas. I graduated in 2015 from Davenport under the auspices of some of the familiar faces here today, like Barbara, worked at our head's office, at our master's office, and she raised me, basically. I am from Hong Kong originally. I graduated with a degree in cognitive science. I wrote some senior thesis on time travel, basically, but I spent a lot of my weekends cooking when I was in New Haven. I opened a restaurant when I was quite young in high school. I was 16 years old in Hong Kong, and it was the last summer before college, basically. And my dad was like, hey, what do you want to do with your last summer here in Hong Kong? I said, I'm not quite sure. And he said, why don't you open a restaurant? Which is a ridiculous way to propose the opening of a restaurant or a business. So we opened a restaurant. And that really has been sort of the guiding force for a lot of the things I've done since then, is this idea of like, or this thought process of like, why don't you do this? So while I was in school at Yale, I spent all of my weekends with this organization that I founded, extracurricular organization called Why Pop Up. We did pop-ups. Basically, it was student-run restaurants 3 days a week. Some people in the audience here today were a big part of it. We'd cook in the beginning in my dorm room, and then eventually in the dive in our buttery, as well as in the student kitchen area. And at some point, to the chagrin of the New Haven Health Department, we were serving something like 200, 250 people in the basement of the dorm every weekend. I kept cooking, and I spent all of my summers in Japan, thinking that I wanted to become a Japanese chef. But it took me cooking in Japan for quite a few years to realize that I was Chinese. People who are quite interested in the relationship between Chinese cooking and Japanese cooking, and I would be tasked with making a staff meal or family meal quite often, and they would ask me to make things like mapo tofu. But as I would serve the mapo tofu that I made, that I had learned from China, right? They would notice the differences between the Japanese version and the Chinese version. And I think that got me quite excited about this idea of food as a narrative device, or rather as a vehicle to talk about culture. So I met my co-founders of my restaurant group, Jun's Kitchen and Nice Day, at Yale. Both of them graduated from the environmental school, the forestry school, as it used to be called. And we opened a restaurant across the street from Deport on Broadway called Jun's Kitchen, where we make fast casual Chinese food. To be frank, this is a closed group, but my PR people don't like me describing it as a Chinese Chipotle or a Chinese Sweet Green, but it very much is a fast casual Chinese restaurant. And we opened a couple in Connecticut. We opened one in Connecticut, a couple in New York City, and are currently opening in other university campuses. We also did a second brand during the pandemic that was called Nice Day. That is quite interesting to me because that restaurant brand is a Chinese takeout place. And by takeout, I mean General Tso's chicken and lo mein and spring rolls and egg rolls and all those things that many people here probably grew up with. That Chinese American food to me is actually quite foreign. It's quite different from the food that I grew up with, but I'm very excited and interested in it because of the history and the industry that built Chinese American food that, you know, Jun's Kitchen was built to revitalize, so to speak. What we realized is during this pandemic particularly is that there's a very sharp decline in these Chinese takeout restaurants from the supply side, even though the demand was going up and up and up. So a lot of, the fact of the matter is, a lot of younger second generation Chinese kids whose parents own these mom and pop takeout places in their neighborhoods, the kids are not coming back to run these restaurants. They're engineers, they're lawyers, they're doctors. There's no reason for them to do one of the most difficult things in the world. So you have a huge amount of these Chinese American restaurants closing, but people still kind of want to see it. And it's already, you know, 150, 170 years later, become a big part of what the American life means. Like Chinese American food in those takeout boxes, that type of like sweet and sour profile, those like super warm, large portion food, that's so much a part of American culture that we wanted to see how we could continue to preserve it, even though a lot of the economics was stacked against it. So Nice Day has since opened our first proper location in Long Island, in Huntington, in the suburbs where it's supposed to be, because it really is supposed to be addressing a sort of national issue. We've opened that first one, and there are a couple more coming along the way in the Connecticut and Long Island area.
So Lucas, you started in Deport, and in 2021, you know, Food and Wine magazine named you Best New Chef. So we're hearing a lot about, you know, how you have a mission and a purpose, and your ability as a restaurateur to sort of meet the moment. But obviously, you know, there's chef right after your name, and the Food and Wine magazine acknowledgement indicates that you're doing something maybe a little bit different, a little bit special in terms of how you're looking at food, what your flavor profiles are. Mm-hmm. Can you share a little bit with us about sort of you as the artist with food as your palette?
I don't know if I'm so much of an artist, but the interesting thing, I think, about the Food and Wine sort of call out is that most of the time when chef awards are given, they're given to people who are chefs of fine dining restaurants making a certain type of food. I did not expect and certainly didn't go into this expecting any sort of recognition of that sort, especially making fast casual food. I kid you not, the best-selling item at Nice Day is a cheeseburger egg roll. There is no finesse to that dish, really. It's cheeseburger and egg roll mashed together. We put it on the menu as a joke because I think it's quite funny, and it's obviously gluttonous and delicious. But it wasn't as if we thought Chinese cheeseburger egg rolls were really going to change everything. We put it on the menu because it was going to start a conversation and attract people to come in. And most of the time, taking into account the modifications of the dishes, at most of what we're selling is General Tso's chicken lo mein, and chicken fried rice. So we're making sort of traditional Chinese American food in that sense. And so that was surprising that like food media began to include people like us in the conversation about how food is progressing and how food is changing. But you're very right to point out that I think a lot of it was to recognize a certain type of like mission-driven sort of restaurant concept, that we were quite keen on understanding what came before us before we started building these restaurants. And for me, a lot of it is recognizing that Chinese American food isn't as monolithic as we think. It doesn't always have to be cheap and quick. It can also be traditional in a sense. I believe Chinese American food is a regional Chinese cuisine that so happens to exist outside of the borders of China. But also that the economics and the business behind how these restaurants are run is quite special. And it's really important to learn from them and to draw from them to build Chinese restaurants in our case, but also in the future to hopefully build other types of restaurants as well. There's a lot to learn from both the front of house and back of house of these Chinese American restaurants. And that's what we're going to be spending the next little couple of years at least doing.
Because it's interesting that you have this awareness and sensitivity to how, Chinese cuisine, going back to the the medieval period, has started to spread through the world and kind of make its way into various world and global cuisines. That a sauce may ultimately, in Africa might have some kind of origin in some Chinese influence. Maybe this is putting you on the spot, but maybe to be specific in terms of some of the kinds of things that, people love about a Chinese American menu. Is there anything that maybe you can point to that people here you would want people to know about or be aware of when they're ordering or asking for it, or sort of unpacking or opening up like a commonly known Chinese American dish?
I could go on and on about this because this is honestly what I love talking about the most. We can pick any dish and we can go down any rabbit hole. But I think one thing to know about Chinese American food, and this is part of the reason why I count myself so lucky to be making Chinese food and be within this Chinese food world, is that Chinese food so happens to be the lens through which I see the world and I see other cuisines. And there's a huge amount of history and depth and breadth to Chinese cooking. I say this because, the other day they found a 4,000-year-old noodle in China, which is to say that it was a piece of it was noodles that was so happened to be packed inside of an urn, and the urn was sort of vacuum sealed, over time air pressure, and they opened it and they found noodles inside, and they carbon dated it to about 4,000 years ago. So we've Chinese people have been making noodles for 4,000 years. Forget the whole Marco Polo bringing noodles to pasta thing. This is can you imagine all the other things like culinarily that have happened in China since then, right? So that's the depth. And in terms of the breadth, one of the things that I've been quite excited about doing is during the pandemic and before, I had this pop-up series called Distance Dining, and the format was always Chinese X something else, and then we'd fill in the blank and work with a collaborative chef to build a menu that was served at a pop-up. And that X could be Chinese Dominican food. We did Indo-Chinese as a Chinese Indian menu. We did a menu on Chinese cooking and the color red, for example. And you really could pick anything and start to draw sort of a line between the influence of Chinese cooking and that said other thing, and vice versa. So you start to build this sort of wonderful collage of cultural confluences that so happen to have Chinese food be the connector between all of those. And a lot of the reason of this is because there are a lot of Chinese people who've been around for a long time, to oversimplify it, right? And we're also ruthless, reckless restaurateurs. They go every country they go to, open new restaurants. And so there always is a conversation between Chinese cooking and something else, and whatever culture where these restaurateurs sort of land. Given all of this, I think it is really wonderful to see how diverse Chinese cooking can be, especially when we start to think of Chinese food in the future and outside of the borders of China. And that's what we're beginning to explore here. One great example is of this sort of like cultural confluence within Chinese American food is probably like the crab rangoon. The crab rangoon is, I think many people here will have had it before. It's very American. It is like, I think it's I want to say it's either the third or the fourth most ordered Chinese American dish in Chinese restaurants in the US. I just came back from Toronto. I've spent about 2-3 months this year cooking in Toronto, and nobody knows what a crab rangoon is in Toronto. They're right there. They're an hour and 15 minutes flight away, and they don't know what a crab rangoon is. It's very American because after the Second World War, you have a lot of soldiers coming back with this taste of sort of, broadly speaking, the islands. And there's a little bit of an interest in sort of a tiki culture, to oversimplify things. And Chinese people, Chinese restaurateurs, are the first and the quickest to appropriate all of it, to say all of tiki culture is now sweet and sour sauce and pineapples and scorpion bowls and poo-poo platters. And they adopt all these like influences, half of it's sort of made up, half of it's built off of mistranslations, like crab rangoon, rangoon being coming from Yangon, obviously, and Yangon, which is so happens the dish that we've decided to name crab rangoon after is cream cheese wonton with fake crab in it, right? It's Mongolian beef, also nothing to do with Mongolia. Some of you might have had Beijing beef, nothing to do with Beijing. Like, just like these like silly little funny mistranslations end up being a dish. But the key, I think, here is, number one, there's something special, I think, about Chinese food and how it's developed in absorbing culture. And now sometimes, if someone were to do it for their own credit, it would come off as, I think it is certainly a type of cultural appropriation. On the other hand, there's something to be said about tradition, and tradition isn't defined in the moment, but it's, especially culinary traditions, take a little while to define themselves. And now that we've been eating culinary crab rangoons for 50, 60, 70 years, now it's just a part of the lexicon of Chinese food. Nobody even thinks of this as Southeast Asian at all, right? If you look at the dish itself, there's nothing really about it that's Southeast Asian. The sweet and sour sauce has nothing to do with how sweet and sours are built in Southeast Asia or Burma, Myanmar, at the least. So anyway, that's just one story, but we could go on and on and on.
Because I saw something about how there was one article with you about you wanting to perfect a certain dish, and one of the things that you were finding that was working for you was using ketchup. Mm-hmm. And so you don't necessarily have any kind of compunctions about what you might use to get to a certain kind of taste. Mm-hmm. As long as it's kind of working and kind of doing what it is you want it to do.
I think some of it is to reject sort of like too old, like sometimes people have sort of ingredient cultural superiority, and you need to find another perspective into understanding a lot of shelf stable items. Of course, ketchup is not a nutritious celebration of the tomato, right? But it is a celebration of ketchup, as it is something that was left in Hong Kong after British colonization. The same thing for Spam, I think, is a really great example of, Spam in and of itself is not a nutritious celebration of the pig or the land or the terroir, but it is, like, if we think of it in a different perspective and we look at how it's used in a lot of Asian cultures, you'll find that something like Spam is a delicious, first of all, delicious, but also a representative of a specific type of culture, oftentimes to do with colonization. There are always different perspectives to look at these ingredients, and especially with things like ketchup, it's a part of the tradition that I grew up in Hong Kong, in cha chan tangs, as in like Hong Kong diners. So I'm quite okay with using ketchup and being specific about when I'm using ketchup. If I'm building a tomato consomme or something in the French context, obviously it would be out of place, or you would have to use it in a very specific and loud way. You'd have to call yourself out on it.
So we're starting to get questions in the chat, and Marie Ann Hamilton has a very interesting query about the back of the house. Marie Ann, do you want to ask your question?
It's just, you see so many chefs and nationally acclaimed owners of restaurant, famous restaurants, no longer in their positions because of abusive behavior.
Mhm.
And it just is a common because of the intense situation in the kitchen. The atmosphere, you have to get things out. Do you address that at all in your work?
It's a really great question. And I think it's pertinent and it's really important. So kitchens, and this is before we jump into talking about the rest of the food chain and the supply chain. I think restaurants are quite broken as they are right now. A lot of it stems from a type of culture that I don't think is sustainable. And I use the word sustainable in a careful way, because sustainability isn't just environmental sustainability, it's also sustainability of people and labor and culture. And it's whatever allows the next generation to do better than we did, right? So different restaurants and different kitchens have to address those issues differently because those problems manifest differently. I could tell you that comparing one male chef to another male chef, I don't yell as much as the people I used to work for example, right? I'm also not a very yelly type of person. But I think a lot of it oftentimes in Chinese restaurant spaces comes down to a question of ownership and equity. So one of the things that is really important to us when we're building new Nice Day restaurants is a partnership with the previous custodians, or rather the previous owners of these mom and pop restaurants. I'll give you an example of the first one we opened in Long Island. So Mr. Zhang inherited this restaurant. He's from Fujian. He inherited this restaurant about 14 years ago on a strip mall. It's about 900 square feet. It's got 6 seats in the front and a massive mirror with etched koi on it and bamboo and all this, all the typical Chinese takeout place stuff. And he had his 2 children, a son and a daughter, who went to Columbia and Cornell respectively. We have Junzi Kitchens, not Cornell, sorry, Columbia and NYU. And we have restaurants next to Columbia and NYU, so happens. His kids read about us in the New York Times and our hope to try to revitalize a lot of these Chinese American restaurants, and so put us in touch with their father. Mr. Zhang doesn't want to be in the kitchen anymore, but he likes the idea of being an entrepreneur and owning a part of the business. So when we built our first restaurant, our first Nice Day there, he was involved very much in the build out, the permitting process, so much that he saved us a lot of construction time. Restaurants often can take 3 months to a year to build out. For us, it only took a month and a half, in no small part because we were working with Mr. Zhang. He was on our payroll for a very long time as we onboarded the next sort of generation of staff, and he has a little bit of equity in that business, which for me is really important, and it starts to change some of that sort of like restaurant ownership culture by involving the last generation, because they have so much to teach us, they have so much to help, but also we can alleviate some of the pressures that they have. Compare this with the next restaurant we're about to open, who's actually owned by a Singaporean lady. She doesn't want to cook in restaurants anymore. Unlike Mr. Zhang, she doesn't really want to be a part of it anymore. She just wants to get this massive lease off of her hands that nobody will take. So she is interested in cooking her own food, Singaporean food, which she hasn't been able to cook before. So we're working with her to onboard her onto some e-commerce platforms so that she can make sort of packaged meals without having to work inside of a hot kitchen, right? So I think understanding the people that you're working with and what ownership looks like to them is a really important part of kitchens. And I say this in the abstract way because I do believe this is applicable to kitchens that are filled with younger line cooks, for example, who oftentimes don't feel a sense of ownership because they don't get to help develop dishes, for example. They don't get to put dishes on the menu. They don't see a clear career path for themselves moving upwards, and oftentimes are not paid enough. So yeah, different kitchens, different solutions, but this is one of the ways that we're looking at it, and it's really important to us.
Barbara, do you want to ask your question next?
Sure. Have you, Lucas, nice to see you. Have you found that there are regional differences of Chinese American food throughout the country? Like if you go to DC, is it different than in New York or San Francisco or Chicago?
Absolutely. And it is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I would like to write a book about this one day. And it helps dispel this idea that Chinese American food is just same everywhere. You hear a lot of people say things like, sesame chicken in Arizona tastes exactly the same as sesame chicken in Maine, which is true, but that doesn't mean that restaurants in Arizona only serve these dishes that are exactly copied in Maine. So one of my little hobbies is collecting these dishes that are hyper regional. I'll give a great example is the corned beef egg roll, which is in Detroit. If anyone's had it in Detroit before, the corned beef egg roll is invented by a Vietnamese lady working in a Jewish deli, serving Irish-style corned beef, chopping up the ends, putting it inside of a Chinese American vessel that is the egg roll, serving it with bang bang sauce, or I forget, like yum yum sauce or something. I forget what they call it, but it's basically Thousand Island, which obviously has nothing to do with a Thousand Islands, and served primarily to black and white blue collar Americans. It's a ridiculous and beautiful sort of amalgamation of all of these cultures in one. But it doesn't really make it outside of Detroit. You don't get corned beef egg rolls in Philadelphia, where you have cheesesteak egg rolls actually now, but you don't get them outside of Detroit. And you can find examples like that everywhere. In Springfield, they have cashew chicken. Some places serve cashew chicken now, but it was invented by one person at Springfield, Massachusetts. Up in Canada, Edmonton, Canada has a penchant love for green onion cakes, which are basically scallion pancakes, but they are not exactly as layered or crispy as the Shanghainese ones, and then aren't puffed up like the Nanjing style ones either. They're sort of an in-between, and they're served at every single bar. Why that's the case, nobody quite knows. Probably it was really popular at one or two Chinese American restaurants, and some other places started copying it and putting it on their menu, but you find those all over the place. Some of these sort of hyper-regional dishes have wonderful histories and are very interesting and delicious, and others are a lot less delicious. Like the chow mein sandwich is a New England thing. Maybe some of us have had it here before, but it's basically a deep fried noodles tossed in brown sauce, and it's very sloppy. It's really wet, and they put it on top of a hamburger bun, and almost as a garnish, they put the top bun on top of this big moppy mess. It's not really a sandwich in that you can't quite pick it up. I don't think it's a very delicious thing, but it has a very specific history to do with mistranslation involving an Italian pasta company. Yes, there are small differences in between the different regions, and I would love to collect them all. And so if anybody here has any of those stories, please let me know.
So it's great. We're getting quite a few questions in chat, and Joseph's question actually kind of nicely dovetails on Barbara. Joseph, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I was just kind of curious as to what the differences between Chinese cuisine as it is understood in China and Chinese cuisine as it is, let's say, understood in the United States would be. I mean, you said that they're completely different. In what way?
Right. I think specifically here, I'm referring to American Chinese food versus sort of Chinese food more broadly in China. So if we were to understand Chinese American food as a regional type of Chinese food, and then we started to break up all the Chinese food in China into different regions as well, right? Shanghai, for example, Huayang is another one, Cantonese, Sichuan, Northeast, then Chinese American food is one specific type of Chinese American or one specific type of Chinese food. That Chinese American food usually is has its roots in Southern Chinese cooking, broadly, mostly Cantonese, Hunan, some Sichuan. And it's characterized oftentimes by sweet and sour, I think is one of the main flavor profiles. A lot of use of brown sauce or thickened oyster sauce and soy sauce, which creates that sort of lovely savory flavor. A lot of stir-fried noodles, stir-fried rice. And then the biggest part of it is a lot of deep frying chicken and tossing it in variations in sweet and sour sauce. I'll tell you that the first time I had Chinese American food was when I was in middle school, visiting some friends at a summer school in the US. And I remember on Tuesday nights at around 9 o'clock, this man would pull up in a van in the hatchback, and he would pop open his trunk, and he would just have something like 40 or 50 of these styrofoam packed Chinese American sort of combo boxes at this summer school, at this school. And the kids would rush out and give him $7, and he would give you a box. He would ask you if you wanted sesame chicken, General Tso's, or orange chicken or whatnot. And I remember eating a General Tso's from one friend's box and sesame from another guy's box and then orange from over there. And I could not tell you, and even to this day, I have a hard time identifying the difference between orange chicken and General Tso's chicken and sweet and sesame chicken. It is largely, for me, very, very similar. People who love specific chicken variations will tell you that no, like this General Tso's is good, and this is orange chicken, this is why I think they're different. But for me, they're all quite similar in this sort of like delicious deep fried chicken breast or chicken thigh coated in the cornstarch and flour batter, and then tossed in some sort of sweet, savory, and sour sauce that is thickened with cornstarch. So I think those are the most iconic flavors in Chinese American food. But I would also say that the way it's eaten, which is out of those little Chinese takeout boxes in large portions, oftentimes late night in the big group, is equally a part of what Chinese American food is all about.
So James Kenny actually would like to circle back to kind of your area of study. James, would you ask your question?
Yeah, good evening. First and foremost, thank you, Lucas, very much for participating in this series and giving your time and talent for all of our benefits. I'm very curious, when you shared that your academic background is scientific in nature, I'd really like to learn about, how does that influence your work as a chef, not only creatively, but also just operationally? And how that science background, sort of stays with you, just thinking about your Yale education.
Well, the first thing we should all know is that if the thing you majored in has the word science in it, it's not very scientific. It's sort of like political science, right? Cognitive science, really. I did a little bit of neuroscience, and as I said, I wrote a thesis on time travel. So I don't know how scientific the whole thing was. But what was very special about cognitive science was this idea of interdisciplinary thinking. And every professor was, my favorite classes were all classes where we sat around the table and professor would ask us a question like, so what do we think about free will, for example? And then somebody would answer, who sat in the philosopher's chair would say, well, this is what Spinoza would have said about free will. And then a computer scientist might say, well, if we were to program, a computer with free will, theoretically, how would we do that? And then a biologist might say, oh, look at this study that was done with ants. And so the idea was to address any sort of difficult and complex problem, we can pull in resources with methods of inquiry from any sort of field. And so happens that because cooking and food in general is such a good gateway to talk about so many other things, I think being in the restaurant industry is exactly that. Every day is an interdisciplinary question. There's as much economics to running a restaurant as there is behavioral psychology. Cooking itself is very much art meets science. Science helps explain a huge amount of how to make food delicious, but at some point, artistry and sort of opinion and sort of attitude as to what we put on the plate really sort of takes over. So I credit sort of that I think, liberal arts education a lot to encouraging me to drawing answers from wherever I could get answers from and asking a diverse amount of questions when it comes to something that we might think of as quite simple, like food.
Thank you very much.
So I mistakenly leapfrogged over Alice's question. My bad, Alice. Would you ask your question, please?
Okay, hi, Lucas.
Hi.
Along the lines of some of the financial sides of this, since you've got a broad-based education that's not just about the artistry of the food, but how to run restaurants. I'm worried with the rising food and rent costs. How can these takeout and small Chinese restaurants survive when the costs of food has gotten so high? And yet the expectation of the American public generally about Chinese food is that either it's cheap and fast and good, or it's very high-end, expensive. You have the whole atmosphere that goes with it, and therefore they can charge much more money for it. But generally speaking, it's considered a cheap food that's sort of competing with fast food, and yet it doesn't have the same technology behind it to make it cheaper the way most fast foods. It's more labor intensive, at least in my perspective. So I'm wondering where you think, the future is going to be for that, for these small shops, or even if they turn into chains. I mean, I know Panda, and there have been a number of success stories in that regard, but there's still few and far between.
Yeah, I think so. The reason why Chinese food is cheap, and I really appreciate your question, because most of the time when I speak about this, people ask me the question of, well, one piece of ravioli costs $20 at an Italian restaurant. Why is it so cheap to get a plate of 12 dumplings for half the cost? That's not, or a quarter of the cost. And this is not that question. The question is about sort of, I mean, really, it's like, where do the costs of Chinese American takeout restaurants lie? I think a lot of Chinese regional restaurants, let's say the Sichuanese restaurant that's run by somebody who graduated from NYU in the East Village in New York, this is not that type of restaurant, nor is this the type of restaurant, nor are we talking about restaurants like Haidilao, which is the biggest restaurant group in China, opening new chains over here in malls and so on and so forth. These Chinese American takeout restaurants, the reason why they're so cheap is because of two things, and mostly it's the labor. The way Chinese restaurants often work is that the cooks are very, very skilled at what they do, actually, and they are paid in cash. Oftentimes, they come over to the country, and a lot of this comes out of a tradition of immigration during the Exclusion Act, where the only way you could get into the United States was through business, right? It was that people who would come over would get paid in cash, and then they would have their housing and the food taken care of by the restaurant they were working at. And so oftentimes, Chinese restaurant owners are also landlords because they all have apartments and things for people to live in. Now, as long as Chinese takeout restaurants are able to pay in cash and are able to pay the type of wages they pay their cooks, then Chinese food will continue to be, will have the ability to be cheap the way that Americans often expect Chinese restaurant to be cheap. And the other part is rent. The rent, oftentimes, because these Chinese restaurants they don't have a lot of space for people to sit. So most of the space is dedicated to cooking in the kitchen. And they eventually, if any of you are in blockchains, I like to think of Chinese American restaurants in the US as decentralized, scalable concepts because they're actually spread all over the United States. They're terrifically consistent, and they're ghost kitchens before they're ghost kitchens. And ghost kitchens are sort of restaurants with no storefronts, where you can only get them on delivery on Grubhub and Uber Eats and Seamless and so on and so forth. So because of those two competitive advantages, Chinese restaurants are able to compete on price and bring that price down. Now, a lot of that is changing. Number one, a lot of the labor, the people who are working in these restaurants who are willing to take cash, for example, are not coming to the US anymore. The type of Chinese person who's coming to the US, by and large, not those cooks. And on the other hand, oftentimes, right, these new types of workers, right, will then demand a higher wage, and especially if you have to pay tax, right? And I'm speaking very, very plainly and openly here. That changes the calculus, that changes the business model. And also if there's competition in terms of the rent, because there are ghost kitchens in non-Chinese restaurants now, right? Every restaurant, especially if you live in a big city, you'll and you go on your delivery app, most of the restaurants on there aren't real restaurants with storefronts, right? They're kitchens hidden inside of complexes that have their own sort of economies of scale by sharing kitchens with other concepts and so on and so forth. So now that those things are disrupted, I think more than ever, that's why Nice Day is trying to do what we're trying to do. Is to address some of these issues and some of these questions of competition. I do hope from the technology front that introducing some of the technology that's been missing from Chinese American restaurants will help ease, if not the business model of Chinese American restaurants. I would really like for it to also ease how difficult it is to work in a Chinese restaurant. After our first Nice Day opened, I was there visiting and speaking with the cooks, and I asked them, hey, how's it going? Do you guys like working here? And actually 2 of our cooks used to own Chinese American restaurants, which is wild to me. I was like, you are so overqualified for this job. But they're cooking. I was like, hey guys, like, how's it going? They're like, oh, it's really good. Like, we're busy and stuff. I said, yeah, we're busy. Do you like working here? And they're like, this is the best job I've ever worked. I'm like, why is it? What are you talking about? And he was like, you guys have AC and the kitchen is clean. And that's it. And like the bar is so low to make these like decent workplaces, but also places that people are happy, right? It's bizarre to me that that more people aren't sort of like working on this together. And from the business perspective too, like if we can find a way to harness their skill with the aid of things like technology, or even onboarding them to e-commerce platforms and delivery platforms, and having negotiation power with these delivery companies, for example, then we might start to see Chinese restaurants with pricing and with business models that make a little bit more sense for the current sort of day and age.
So you've been describing different contexts, different situations, different kinds of restaurants. Cindy actually has a very interesting, straightforward, but perhaps very critical question. Cindy, would you ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, Lucas. My question has to do with Chinese restaurant menus. Mm-hmm. If you just merely kind of read through it, do you get a gist of, oh, this is good, or I might try it, or no, I should pass?
I don't think I am able to do that. Also, this is not your question, but I also think the ratings on Google and Yelp are not good for Chinese restaurants. Oftentimes because these days, the people who write on Google and Yelp, people who write Google and Yelp reviews are the people that have specific demands, specifically in terms of service. And I will tell you that most Chinese restaurants, whether modern, traditional, or Chinese American takeout, are not known for service. And so oftentimes they're dinged. And it was funny, I was on social media, I think it was Instagram or TikTok or something, and I saw somebody decently famous, maybe it was a comedian, who said that the best Chinese restaurants are all 3.5 stars. If it's 4 stars, it's not good because it's too clean and they care too much about the service. They should be caring about the food. Sort of funny, sort of true, also not true. But the menu, not really. I think the one thing you can do with menus is you can discern whether there is any loyalty to a specific region. And if there is a very strong regional bias, then you know that those cooks are skilled in that type of region and you would want to stick in that region. Which is to say, if 80% of the menu is filled with mala, hot and spicy dishes like spicy chicken or water, what's the English translation for this, like water salivating chicken or smashed cucumbers, and you see all these Sichuanese dishes on there, don't go off and order the General Tso's chicken, right? And if it's all filled with General Tso's chicken, sesame chicken, you wouldn't go off and order the Cantonese steamed lobster. So you can identify if they have specific specialties. Caveat here is I know a lot of Chinese restaurants have menus that have chef specialty as a section. no, this is not the chef's specialty. That's like the high profit margin items. It's got nothing to do with it, what the chef is special at. And most of the time, the chefs don't really care what they're making. They're just there to work. But anyway, figuring out if they have a regional specialty, I think will guide you towards ordering the right type of thing.
Cool, thank you.
So does that all, for sort of all different kinds of cuisine, international cuisines, there's usually that thing, it's like, the restaurant where the Indians are eating or the restaurant where the Chinese are eating. Does that hold? Like if I land in a city and I'm going out of the hotel looking for a dinner and there's 2 Chinese restaurants, do I eat at the one where I see
Well, Chinese, yeah. I think for Chinese sort of, and again, these are traditional Chinese restaurants, right? I'm not Chinese American restaurants, because if anything, Chinese people are not the arbiters for good Chinese American food. Soccer moms and churches that order catering and schools, those school teachers, those are the people who are experts at Chinese American food. Oftentimes you'll find one really great way to find the Chinese restaurant actually is to figure out where the students are going, especially because there's a huge influx of Chinese students in the United States. And and on WeChat, I'm part of a huge amount of these groups on WeChat that they're called 吃货, and 吃货 is the Chinese slang for foodies, and these foodie groups are constantly buzzing, and Chinese students love talking about food, so they're always saying, oh, they're very opinionated, this is the place to go, this is not the place to go, and if you see a lot of young Chinese students there, it probably is a good establishment.
So Jeff has his hand up, and I'll go to Jeff, and then Noah, as we start getting, time is flying really quickly. I think we have time for Jeff and Noah, maybe another question or so.
Yeah.
Jeff, would you like to ask your question?
I would. Thanks, Stephanie. And look, what a great show. It's so tasty. I know we're all going to be eating for dinner tonight or tomorrow night anyway. So thanks for going. I want to roll back on the Yale part of your experience, and I'm just interested or intrigued. Did you feel that it gave you some footing to reach these aspirational goals that sort of get in your way because you just knew what you wanted to do anyway? Or, I'm just interested in that aspect of it. We've got a lot of Yale alumni, some Yale students on the call, and I just want to blend that in, what that did for you, going to Yale to do what you're doing now.
I think if I didn't go to Yale, I wouldn't be doing what I was doing today. Being from Hong Kong, most of my friends actually ended up going to school in the UK, and God forbid if I submitted myself to some maths and philosophy degree. I think the interdisciplinary part is huge, and also figuring out how to game the Yale resource system is also so important. It's something that Barbara here is very familiar with, because I think I used and abused a lot of the Davenport funds to basically fund a lot of my travel. I was very frugal when I was cooking in Japan, but every year I was in Japan, I had a huge amount of support from our then master and our dean, who helped me out a lot with finding out what I wanted to do and putting myself in the right place to learn those things. The other part of it is the language, which I never thought I would be crediting, but I basically learned how to speak Japanese in a year, and this is standard issue for almost all East Asian undergrad classes, is that within a year and a summer you should be fluent in the language. It's or conversational, right? That's why I ended up in Japan, and the opportunity to travel and cook I think gave me a lot of confidence to leave Yale and not be on the path that many of my classmates were towards consulting and finance. And then one of the things I became quite sensitive to as I was graduating was I heard a lot of people say, my true passion is music education, but I'm going to do the Goldman Sachs thing for a little while. And I just didn't buy into it. And I had a little bit more confidence to say, you know what, we're going to open a fast food restaurant across the street, because I think it might be the right thing to do. A lot of support from the entrepreneurial and sort of like, go get it, try it out for a little bit front.
Noah, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hey, Lucas, thanks for being here and talking to us. I was wondering if you had any ingredients or restaurants or chefs or techniques or equipment or even regions that you're super excited about these days.
What a question. So I stepped away from a lot of my day-to-day culinary duties at Junzi and Nice Day earlier this year, and have spent most of this year traveling and cooking around everywhere, between London and Spain and Canada and Mexico, and different parts of the US. So I have a lot of things I'm very excited about right now. And I'm about to move back to Hong Kong for a couple of months to work on a book and a show. And then I'm going to be moving to Shanghai for about a year to see, because I keep talking about Chinese food, it's about time I actually live in China for a little bit. So there'll be a couple of years over in Asia. But one of the really wonderful chefs, if you want to dig deeper into this, is a chef by the name of Andrew Wong. He went to a little school called Cambridge, and he dropped out of his chemical engineering degree, and he opened a restaurant called A. Wong in London. And he is the first 2 Michelin-starred Chinese restaurant outside of China. A. Wong was the best Chinese food I've had outside of China, and it was a dim sum tasting. And what he was doing there reminds me a lot of the sort of like scientific approach to Chinese food in the English language that we don't get to see very much. He very much is a restaurant Michelin-starred sort of Michelin chef, which means he's very like serious about the technique. And so he's very enamored by anthropology and history as well. And he has a really quite a good podcast that goes into the details of some of his dishes. So Andrew is really, really wonderful, and probably the first person that comes to mind.
So Noah, you put a comment in earlier about somebody that ate at 6,000 different Chinese.
David,
yeah. Is Chinese food something that is of great interest to you? Is this something that you are connecting with?
Well, this talk isn't about me, but I watched Lucas's video about him going out in New York City and drinking a bunch of Long Island iced teas and talking about who he was. And then I saw the email about having a talk with him, so I came to listen in. So
no, this is not the right platform to bring that up. I have a pop-up collective called Shy Boys Club that I do with my friend Eric, who runs really amazing Taiwanese restaurants in New York City. And it's called Shy Boys Club because we get together every month to do these pop-ups. We haven't been doing them since the pandemic, but we're about to do it soon. And it's Shy Boys because we make introverted Asian cuisine, and it's introverted because it's cuisine. You see, I'm rolling my own eyes at myself. It's introverted because it's food that we're too shy to cook in our own restaurants. The idea being, my restaurants are fast casual. The food must be fast casual. He's a Taiwanese chef. He can only make Taiwanese food. So this is like our excuse to do silly things and to cook silly food. And so I think Shy Boys Club is sort of my outlet beyond sort of the restrictions that is authenticity, or what other people think of as authenticity.
So I actually have to ask you, because I even put it in the description, because when I first encountered you online, it was a how-to basically suggesting everybody is cooking tofu wrong. What is the proper way to cook tofu?
I know we talked about this, but first of all, not everyone is cooking tofu. There is a lot of people like to approach tofu, and this is because of how tofu was introduced. But tofu is not just a meat substitute, and we should stop trying to only cook it like steak. So depending on the type of tofu you have, whether it's a silken tofu, which is very, very soft, or stiffer tofu, you would treat it differently. But my general piece of advice, if you're looking to experiment, is, and you're looking for sort of a dried, seared tofu or meat texture, one of the best ways to cook tofu is to freeze it. So you can just freeze the entire pack of firm tofu. So if you have firm tofu, the whole thing can be just thrown into your freezer, or you can take it out, drain out all the water, press it a little bit, and then freeze it, and then defrost it, slice it up, and cook it. Because what's going to happen is the water inside of the tofu is going to become crystals as it becomes ice, and then it'll start to break open the sort of cell structure of this tofu, therefore making it basically literally into a sponge. It'll it'll push all that water out as being defrosted, and it'll let that tofu, it'll make that tofu soak up whatever sauce or braising liquid you're using to cook it in. It'll make it very, very flavorful. And then for silken tofu, the only piece of advice for silken tofu is to use it in braises and stews. Basically, if you look to a lot of like Japanese and Korean dishes, especially Korean dishes like sundubu, which is a tofu kimchi gochujang stew, you'll find a lot of silken tofu used, not like a meat substitute at all, but it's its own silky, delicious thing.
So we are at the top of the hour. And before we head on out, I want to remind people that, and Yvette, correct me if I'm wrong, that next week we will be switching back to the regular time. Thursday nights must see Yale. And I want to make sure as we close out, I mean, we have covered a lot of territory and it's all been fantastic, and you've been marvelous, Lucas, but I want to make sure that before we go out, that you are able to share whatever it is that you wanted to bring to this group's attention. And if anything else, I'll also throw in Alice's question that she wants to know what your comfort food is.
I dropped my contact information into the chat, and in case, I think that's the most important thing is like, if you want to continue the conversation, please do. Instagram is the best place to reach me, and that's my username, but email is totally fine as well. There's a lot going on in Chinese food, and just go ahead and I keep eating different types of Chinese food. It's my maybe parting words. My comfort food, though, is white rice, as is. My dad called me a rice bucket growing up because I would eat 3 bowls of rice at every meal. It really is my favorite food in the world. Everything goes great on top of it. And now that I've grown up and sort of like gotten to know different types of rice, I've sort of developed a little bit more of a palate for the refined sort of differences between different types of rice, different species of rice, and so on and so forth. But that is, white rice is really just my comfort food.
Great. And reminder, if any of you are in New Haven or get to New Haven, Junza is on Broadway. So get a sweatshirt and go to Junza. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks so very much, Lucas. We really appreciate you being with us this evening. It's been great.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.